Indian Subcontinent, History of India. Part 6. The Indian indenture system was an ongoing system of indenture, a form of debt bondage, by which 3.5 million Indians were transported to colonies of European powers to provide labor for the plantations. It started from the end of slavery in 1833 and continued until 1920. This resulted in the development of a large Indian diaspora that spread from the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean and the growth of large Indo-Caribbean and Indo-African populations. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was a large-scale rebellion by soldiers employed by the British East India Company in northern and central India against the company's rule. The spark that led to the mutiny was the issue of new gunpowder cartridges for the Enfield rifle, which was insensitive to local religious prohibition. The key mutineer was Mangal Pandey. In addition, the underlying grievances over British taxation, the ethnic gulf between the British officers and their Indian troops, and land annexations played a significant role in the rebellion. Within weeks after Pandey's mutiny, dozens of units of the Indian Army joined peasant armies in widespread rebellion. The rebel soldiers were later joined by Indian nobility, many of whom had lost title and domains under the doctrine of lapse and felt that the company had interfered with a traditional system of inheritance. Rebel leaders such as Nana Sahib and the Rani of Jhansi belonged to this group. After the outbreak of the mutiny in Meerut, the rebels very quickly reached Delhi. The rebels had also captured large tracts of the northwestern provinces in Awadh. Most notably, in Awadh, the rebellion took on the attributes of a patriotic revolt against British presence. However, the British East India Company mobilized rapidly with the assistance of friendly princely states, but it took the British the better part of 1858 to suppress the rebellion. Due to the rebels being poorly equipped and having no outside support or funding, they were brutally subdued. In the aftermath, all power was transferred from the British themselves adopted a carrot-and-stick approach in response to renewed nationalist demands. The means of achieving the proposed measure were later enshrined in the Government of India Act 1919, which introduced the principle of a dual mode of administration, or Dayaj, in which elected Indian legislators and appointed British officials shared power. In 1919, Colonel Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire their weapons on peaceful protesters, including unarmed women and children, resulting in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which led to the non-cooperation movement of 1,920,192. The massacre was a decisive episode towards the end of British rule in India. From 1920, leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi began highly popular mass movements to campaign against the British Raj using largely peaceful methods. The Gandhi-led independence movement opposed the British rule using non-violent methods like non-cooperation, civil disobedience, and economic resistance. However, revolutionary activities against the British rule took place throughout the Indian subcontinent, and some others adopted a militant approach like the Hindustan Republican Association that sought to overthrow British rule by armed struggle. The All India Azad Muslim Conference gathered in Delhi in April 1940 to voice its support for an independent and united India. Its members included several Islamic organizations in India, as well as 14 nationalist Muslim delegates. The pro-separatist All India Muslim League worked to try to silence those nationalist Muslims who stood against the partition of India, often using intimidation and coercion. The murder of the All India Azad Muslim Conference leader Ali Bakhsh Sumro also made it easier for the pro-separatist All India Muslim League to demand the creation of a Pakistan. British East India Company to the British Crown, which began to administer most of India as provinces. The Crown controlled the company's lands directly and had considerable indirect influence over the rest of India, which consisted of the princely states ruled by local royal families. There were officially 565 princely states in 1947, but only 21 had actual state governments, and only 3 were large. They were absorbed into the independent nation in 1947-48. After 1857, the colonial government strengthened and expanded its infrastructure via the court system, legal procedures, and statutes. The Indian Penal Code came into being. In education, Thomas Babington Macaulay had made schooling a priority for the Raj in 1835 and succeeded in implementing the use of English for instruction. By 1890, some 60,000 Indians had matriculated. The Indian economy grew at about 1% per year from 1880 to 1920, and the population also grew at 1%. However, from 1910 Indian private industry began to grow significantly. India built a modern railway system in the late 19th century, which was the 4th largest in the world. Historians have been bitterly divided on issues of economic history, with the nationalist school arguing that India was poorer due to British rule. In 1905, Lord Curzon split the large province of Bengal into a largely Hindu western half and eastern Bengal and Assam, a largely Muslim eastern half. The British goal was said to be efficient administration, but the people of Bengal were outraged at the apparent divide and rule strategy. It also marked the beginning of the organized anti-colonial movement. When the Liberal Party in Britain came to power in 1906, he was removed. Bengal was reunified in 1911. The new Viceroy Gilbert Minto and the new Secretary of State for India John Morley consulted with Congress leaders on political reforms. The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 provided for Indian membership of the provincial executive councils as well as the Viceroy's Executive Council. The Imperial Legislative Council was enlarged from 25 to 60 members, and separate communal representation for Muslims was established in a dramatic step towards representative and responsible government. Several socio-religious organizations came into being at that time. Muslims set up the All India Muslim League in 1906 to protect the interests of the aristocratic Muslims. The Hindu Mahasabha and Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh sought to represent Hindu interests, though the latter always claimed it to be a cultural organization. Sikhs founded the Shiromani Akali Dal in 1920. However, the largest and oldest political party, Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, attempted to keep a distance from the socio-religious movements and identity politics. The Bengali Renaissance refers to a social reform movement dominated by Bengali Hindus in the Bengal region of the Indian subcontinent during the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of British rule. Historian Nitish Sengupta describes the Renaissance as having started with reformer and humanitarian Raja Ram Mohan Roy and ended with Asia's first Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. This flowering of religious and social reformers, scholars, and writers is described by historian David Kopf as one of the most creative periods in Indian history. During this period, Bengal witnessed an intellectual awakening that is in some ways similar to the Renaissance. This movement questioned existing orthodoxies, particularly with respect to women, marriage, the dowry system, the caste system, and religion. One of the earliest social movements that emerged during this time was the Young Bengal movement, which espoused rationalism and atheism as the common denominators of civil conduct among upper-caste educated Hindus. It played an important role in reawakening Indian minds and intellect across the Indian subcontinent. During British East India Company and British Crown rule, India experienced some of deadliest ever recorded famines. These famines, usually resulting from crop failures and often exacerbated by policies of the colonial government, included the Great Famine of 1,876,187, in which 6.1 million to 10.3 million people died. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770, where between 1 and 10 million people died. The Indian Famine of 1,899,109 Tisro, in which 1.25 to 10 million people died. And the Bengal Famine of 1943, where between 2.1 and 3.8 million people died. The third plague pandemic in the mid-19th century killed 10 million people in India. Despite persistent diseases and famines, the population of the Indian subcontinent, which stood at up to 200 million in 1750, had reached 389 million by 1941. During World War I, over 800,000 volunteered for the army, and more than 400,000 volunteered for non-combat roles, compared with the pre-war annual recruitment of about 15,000 men. The army saw early action on the Western Front at the First Battle of Ypres. After a year of front-line duty, sickness and casualties had reduced the Indian Corps to the point where it had to be withdrawn. Nearly 700,000 Indians fought the Turks in the Mesopotamian campaign. Indian formations were also sent to East Africa, Egypt, and Gallipoli. Indian Army and Imperial Service troops fought during the Sinai and Palestine campaigns, defense of the Suez Canal in 1950, at Romani in 1960, and to Jerusalem in 1917. India units occupied the Jordan Valley, and after the German Spring Offensive they became the major force in the Egyptian Expeditionary Force during the Battle of Megiddo, and in the Desert Mounted Corps advanced to Damascus and on to Aleppo. Other divisions remained in India guarding the northwest frontier and fulfilling internal security obligations. 1 million Indian troops served abroad during the war. In total, 74,187 died, and another 67,000 were wounded. The roughly 90,000 soldiers who died fighting in World War I and the Afghan wars are commemorated by the India Gate. British India officially declared war on Nazi Germany in September 1939. The British Raj, as part of the Allied nations, sent over 2.5 million volunteer soldiers to fight under British command against the Axis powers. Additionally, several princely states provided large donations to support the Allied campaign. India also provided the base for American operations in support of China and the China-Burma-India theater. Indians fought with distinction throughout the world, including in the European theater against Germany, in North Africa against Germany and Italy, against the Italians in East Africa, in the Middle East against the Vichy French, in the South Asian region defending India against the Japanese, and fighting the Japanese in Burma. Indians also aided in liberating British colonies such as Singapore and Hong Kong after the Japanese surrender in August 1945. Over 87,000 soldiers from the subcontinent died in World War II. The Indian National Congress denounced Nazi Germany, but would not fight it or anyone else until India was independent. Congress launched the Quit India movement in August 1942, refusing to cooperate in any way with the government until independence was granted. The government immediately arrested over 60,000 national and local Congress leaders. The Muslim League rejected the Quit India movement and worked closely with the Raj authorities. Subhas Chandra Bose broke with Congress and tried to form a military alliance with Germany or Japan to gain independence. The Germans assisted Bose in the formation of the Indian Legion. However, it was Japan that helped him revamp the Indian National Army after the First Indian National Army under Mohan Singh was dissolved. The INA fought under Japanese direction, mostly in Burma. Bose also headed the Provisional Government of Free India, a government in exile based in Singapore. By 1942, neighboring Burma was invaded by Japan, which by then had already captured the Indian territory of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Japan gave nominal control of the islands to the Provisional Government of Free India on the 21st of October 1943, and in the following March, the Indian National Army with the help of Japan crossed into India and advanced as far as Kohima in Nagaland. This advance on the mainland of the Indian subcontinent reached its farthest point on Indian territory, retreating from the Battle of Kohima in June and from that of Imphal on the 3rd of July 1944. The region of Bengal in British India suffered a devastating famine during 1940,194. An estimated 2.13 million died from the famine, frequently characterized as man-made, with most sources asserting that wartime colonial policies exacerbated the crisis. The numbers of British in India were small, yet they were able to rule 52% of the Indian subcontinent directly and exercise considerable leverage over the princely states that accounted for 48% of the area. One of the most important events of the 19th century was the rise of Indian nationalism, leading Indians to seek first self-rule and later complete independence. However, historians are divided over the causes of its rise. Probable reasons include a clash of interests of the Indian people with British interests, racial discriminations, and the revelation of India's past. The first step toward Indian self-rule was the appointment of councillors to advise the British Viceroy in 1861, and the first Indian was appointed in 1909. Provincial councils with Indian members were also set up. The councillors' participation was subsequently widened into legislative councils. The British built a large British Indian army, with the senior officers all British and many of the troops from small minority groups such as Gurkhas from Nepal and Sikhs. The civil service was increasingly filled with natives at the lower levels, with the British holding the more senior positions. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, an Indian nationalist leader, declared Swaraj as the destiny of the nation. His popular sentence, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it," became the source of inspiration. Tilak was backed by rising public leaders like Bipin Chandra Pal and Lala Lajpat Rai, who held the same point of view. Notably, they advocated the Swadeshi movement involving the boycott of imported items and the use of Indian-made goods. The triumvirate were popularly known as Lal Bal Pal. In 1907, the Congress was split into two factions. The Radicals, led by Tilak, advocated civil agitation and direct revolution to overthrow the British Empire and the abandonment of all things British. The Moderates, led by leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale, on the other hand, wanted reform within the framework of British rule. The partition of Bengal in 1905 further increased the revolutionary movement for Indian independence. The disenfranchisement leads some to take violent action. In January 1946, several mutinies broke out in the armed services, starting with that of RAF servicemen frustrated with their slow repatriation. The mutinies came to a head with mutiny of the Royal Indian Navy in Bombay in February 1946, followed by others in Calcutta, Madras, and Karachi. The mutinies were rapidly suppressed. In early 1946, new elections were called and Congress candidates won in 8 of the 11 provinces. Late in 1946, the Labour government decided to end British rule of India, and in early 1947 it announced its intention of transferring power no later than June 1948. and participating in the formation of an interim government. Along with the desire for independence, tensions between Hindus and Muslims had also been developing over the years. Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah proclaimed the 16th of August 1946 as Direct Action Day, with the stated goal of highlighting peacefully the demand for a Muslim homeland in British India, which resulted in the outbreak of the cycle of violence that would be later called the Great Calcutta Killing of August 1946. The communal violence spread to Bihar, Noakhali in Bengal, Garmukhteshwar in the United Provinces, and on to Rawalpindi in March 1947, in which Sikhs and Hindus were attacked or driven out by Muslims. In August 1947, the British Indian Empire was partitioned into the Union of India and Dominion of Pakistan. In particular, the partition of Punjab and Bengal led to rioting between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs in these provinces and spread to other nearby regions, leaving some 500,000 dead. The police and army units were largely ineffective. The British officers were gone, and the units were beginning to tolerate, if not actually indulge in violence against their religious enemies. Also, this period saw one of the largest mass migrations anywhere in modern history, with a total of 12 million Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims moving between the newly created nations of India and Pakistan. In 1971, Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan and East Bengal, seceded from Pakistan. Thank you for watching.